What would you do if, in the middle of a funeral, the person who was supposed to be in the coffin appeared right in front of you? It sounds like a scene from a horror movie, doesn't it? But there is nothing fictional here, as this is a true story. Nella lived with her husband and his children in Australia. She and her husband had met 11 years ago, and their marriage seemed to be going well, but that was not the case. Unfortunately, one day she received the news that her stepmother had passed away. As a result, she had to travel about 12,000 kilometers for the funeral of a relative she loved very much. Since it was a last-minute trip, she had to leave all 8 of her children with her husband, but she thought this was not a cause for concern. After all, he was their father. However, she made a mistake that she would soon learn about. Nella's stepmother's funeral was very sad. After the ceremony, she returned to her hotel to rest for a bit. Around that time, her husband called her. After exchanging a few words, he advised her to go outside for some fresh air as it would make her feel better. She replied that it was a good idea. Following her husband's advice, Nella did not know that what she was about to do would be one of her biggest mistakes. She went downstairs thinking she would have a moment of peace and quiet. However, as soon as she exited the hotel, a man pointed a gun at her and told her not to scream because he would shoot her. Feeling very scared, she followed all his instructions and soon found herself blindfolded in a car. Half an hour later, she was tied to a chair in an abandoned building, completely lost. The woman had no idea where she was and had already begun to accept the idea that she might never see her children again. Those moments of terror did not pass quickly. After 2 days of captivity, one of the men asked her what she had done to make her husband want to take her life. Upon hearing these words, Nella was stunned. Her world collapsed. This could only be a mistake. They must be lying. There's no way her husband would want to do something like that. The kidnappers even asked if Nella had cheated on her husband. She said no and mentioned that they had a beautiful family with 8 children. The kidnappers were confused about how to resolve the situation. One of them called the husband. Nella froze immediately when she recognized his voice on the other end of the line. When the kidnapper asked again, the man clearly said, "Eliminate her." Although she knew that her husband was bad with some people, she could never imagine he would try to end her life like this. After all, they had been together for 11 years. What would happen to their children? How would her family cope with the idea that there was a chance she might never return to Australia? She felt desperate and confused. But then Nella was shocked. The kidnappers said they never intended to harm her. In fact, coincidentally, these 2 men knew Nella's brother. They didn't like doing bad things to women or children and leaving them orphaned. Their goal was to save Nella and additionally get the money that her husband had promised. They then released her and told her to go home and warn other women in her family that if they have an abusive husband, they should leave him immediately because he could be capable of anything, using herself as an example. Shocked but determined not to waste any time, Nella began planning her revenge. Before they let her go free, they handed her a memory card with all the evidence against her husband. She contacted embassies for immediate repatriation back to Australia and even called her church pastor. Together they found a way to repatriate Nella without raising suspicion from her husband or any other family members. Thus, a large funeral was organized for this purpose and she had missed many of her family's hearts and friends' gatherings. However, this was not an ordinary funeral as we usually see. In fact, it hid more mysteries than even Michelle's funeral did on that day. But what was strange about this mystery? The information given to family members regarding the woman was still vague. No one understood exactly why she had lost her life. All they knew was that she was the mother of 8 children who had died in a tragic car accident. The accident was so severe that it wasn't even possible for the body to be buried due to the collision. Everything seemed very strange, but nonetheless, the funeral continued. Among those present at the ceremony were also her husband, now widowed, at least that's how it appeared. To everyone's surprise, Nella suddenly appeared from the door where the funeral service was taking place. This naturally caused the event to come to an abrupt end as everyone panicked. The only one who wasn't crying was her husband. This appearance felt surreal. It was like seeing a ghost right in front of him, but there was nothing supernatural about what he saw at that moment. Unfortunately for him, Nella was indeed alive. But why was this bad for him? Shouldn't a husband be happy that his wife was alive? This is much more than just a dramatic story, it is a story of revenge. When Nella arrived home, she realized one thing: her husband had already announced the news to everyone else. She entered her house and waited for some family members from the ceremony to leave. So on the day of the funeral, the entire community came together to comfort her grieving husband. After a few minutes, when people began leaving, the despised husband experienced the biggest shock of his life when he saw what had appeared at his wife's funeral. No one could even believe it. It was immense joy for those family members who were still there witnessing their beloved alive again, but yet it remained a tragedy for her husband. Right before him stood his wife's ghost, glaring at him, looking at him intently. Nella spoke with surprise, "I am still alive." He put his hands on his shoulders and realized she really was alive. He then burst into tears. The woman realized she was face to face with the fraud who had lived beside her for over a decade. It felt like being reborn until that moment when Nella called the police and surrounded him after he initially denied everything but then confessed he tried to take her life because he feared she might leave him for another man. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison and additionally prohibited from approaching his ex-wife again. However, for Nella, the story did not end there. Many people living in that community blamed her for reporting her husband, and numerous anonymous threats followed, along with an attempted burglary at her home. Today, after all this turmoil, Nella is no longer the same person. She says she still hears her husband's voice ordering her destruction but does not fear him anymore. She states, "I will rise up, I will become strong. My previous life is gone, now I am starting anew." She has even become an example for all women suffering from some form of violence from their partners.